My name is Dorothy. I'm 64 years old, and for most of my life, I was a school librarian in a small town outside of Columbus, Ohio. I thought I knew what love looked like. I thought after 40 years of living, I'd earned enough wisdom to recognize danger before it found me. I was wrong, and the moment I understood just how wrong I was lying on my kitchen floor, unable to move, listening to my husband rehearse the lie he was about to tell the paramedics. What he didn't know, what he couldn't have predicted, was that the woman who answered my call that night had seen his kind before, and she wasn't going to let him walk away. I need you to stay with me through this story. I know it's hard to hear. Some of it was hard to live through, but I'm sharing it because I know there are women watching this right now. Women my age, women who think they're too old or too proud or too far in to get out. And I need them to know that it is never too late. Before I take you back to the beginning, please take a second to like this video, subscribe to this channel, and leave a comment below telling me where you're watching from. It helps more people find stories like mine. It helps survivors feel less alone. Now let me tell you how I got here. I met my husband when I was 57 years old. I want you to understand that. 57. I was not a young woman swept off her feet by charm she didn't yet have the experience to question. I had lived a full life before him. I had raised 2 children mostly on my own after my husband passed away from a heart attack when I was 43. I had worked 30 years building a career I was proud of. I had buried a husband, paid off a mortgage, and watched my children grow into adults who called me every Sunday. I thought I was past the stage of life where someone could fool me that completely. I met him at my church. He had moved to Columbus after retiring from a long career as a high school principal up in Michigan. He was 61, silver-haired, with reading glasses he wore on a chain around his neck, and a habit of holding doors open for strangers. He volunteered at the food pantry on Saturday mornings. He brought homemade peach preserves to the fall festival. Every single person in that congregation thought he was the most decent man they'd ever met. I thought so too. He was patient with me. That's the part I keep coming back to, even now. He was so patient. He didn't rush me. He didn't push. We had coffee after services for 3 months before he asked if I'd like to have dinner. We dated for over a year before he suggested we get married. He sat across from my daughter and listened to her talk about her father for an entire evening without checking his phone once. My son shook his hand at Thanksgiving and told me afterward, "Mom, I really like him. He seemed solid." We got married in a small ceremony at the church. Just family and close friends. I wore a cream-colored dress and carried yellow roses. I didn't cry walking down the aisle. I laughed, actually. I felt lighter than I had in years, like something good had finally found me again after a long wait. The first sign came 8 months in. Not a slap, not a shout. Something quieter, which is maybe why I didn't recognize it for what it was. We were having dinner with my daughter and her husband. The conversation turned to a book I'd recommended, and I was in the middle of explaining why I loved it when he put his hand over mine on the table and said, with a smile so pleasant you wouldn't have noticed anything wrong, "Dorothy tends to go on a bit when she gets excited about books. It comes with the librarian territory, doesn't it?" Everyone laughed politely. My daughter smiled. I smiled too, because what else do you do in that moment? But in the car on the way home, something sat heavy in my chest. It wasn't until I was getting ready for bed that I realized He had silenced me in front of my own family, and he had done it in a way that made him look charming and made me look like a lovable little eccentric who needed gentle managing. I told myself I was being too sensitive. I was 60 years old. I had seen enough of life to know that people say clumsy things. I let it go. I shouldn't have let it go. Over the next 6 months, the pattern revealed itself so slowly that I kept missing it. He'd correct the way I told stories in front of others. He'd make small comments about my cooking, my clothes, the way I laughed too loudly, always with that pleasant smile, always in a tone that could pass for teasing. When I raised it with him privately, he would look genuinely hurt. He'd say he was just being honest because he loved me, that his first wife had always appreciated his directness. He'd say I was too sensitive, that my late husband had clearly let me get away with things a husband shouldn't. That word, let, it landed wrong every time he used it, but I couldn't quite explain why. By our first anniversary, I had stopped bringing up the things that bothered me because the conversation it started was always worse than the original wound. I had learned to read his moods the way you learn to read weather. The tightening around his jaw, the way he set down his fork just slightly too hard. The particular silence that meant I had done something he would be talking about later, when we were alone. I want to be honest with you about something, because I know people wonder. I stayed partly because of pride. I am not a woman who fails at things. I had already lost one husband. I had already done the hard years alone. I could not stomach the idea of going back to my family and saying I had been wrong about him. I could not stand the thought of my son saying, with his careful, kind voice, "Mom, we can talk about this," when what he meant was, we saw something we couldn't quite name. I had defended this man. I had vouched for him. Admitting the truth felt like it would cost me something I wasn't sure I could afford. The first time he grabbed me, I had been married to him for 14 months. I had made a comment at dinner, something about a former colleague of his who I'd met at church, something neutral and forgettable. He reached across the table, grabbed my wrist, and squeezed it so hard my vision went white. He didn't say anything. He just held it, looked at me, and then let go and finished his meal like nothing had happened. I sat there with my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears. The food on my plate went cold. That night, lying in the dark, while he slept beside me, I told myself at least a dozen things that weren't true. I told myself he had just had a bad day. I told myself I must have said something that hit a nerve I didn't know about. I told myself 61-year-old retired principals don't become abusers. I told myself a lot of things. What I did not tell myself was the truth. Over the following year, the grabbing became shoving. The shoving became hitting. It was always somewhere that wouldn't show. A slap to the back of the head, a fist in the side where a blouse would cover it. He understood optics. He had been managing his public image for 4 decades. He knew exactly what he was doing and exactly how to do it without leaving a trace anyone would believe. And there was the other thing, the thing people don't talk about enough when they talk about physical abuse, the isolation. He was subtle about it at first. He'd schedule things on the same night as my plans with friends, then act wounded when I chose to go anyway. He'd make a remark the next morning about how I'd seemed more interested in other people than in my own husband. Slowly, without any single moment I could point to, I started canceling more than I attended. My daughter started texting instead of calling. My son's Sunday calls started feeling like duty checks. I could hear myself giving them the same short answers, the same fine, things are fine, I'll talk to you soon. I thought about leaving every single day. Every morning when I woke up and assessed what hurt and whether it would show, I thought about it. But I had no money of my own anymore. He managed our finances, which I had agreed to because I was tired, and it seemed efficient, and I trusted him. God help me. I trusted him. My name wasn't on the lease of the house we'd moved into. I had given up my apartment when we married. I didn't know where I would go or how I would explain it, or whether anyone would believe a 61-year-old retired librarian who had willingly married this man in front of her entire church community. He told me often, with that measured educator's voice, that no one would believe me, that I was an old woman, that people would say I was confused, grieving my first husband, imagining things. He said it so calmly, it almost sounded reasonable. That is the thing about an intelligent abuser. He doesn't have to scream. He just has to make you doubt yourself until the doubt does the screaming for him. The night everything changed, I had done nothing. I want to be clear about that because there was no trigger, no argument, no misspoken word. He had been to a former colleague's retirement dinner and come home in a mood I had learned to dread. Not angry exactly, not yet, but coiled. He walked into the kitchen where I was putting away dishes. He said my name once, quietly, and before I could even turn around, he hit me across the back of my head so hard I went down. I remember the sound of the dish I'd been holding shattering on the tile. I remember putting my hand out to catch myself and my wrist folding wrong underneath me. I remember trying to get up and not being able to. I remember that the pain in my chest, not emotional, physical, actual pain, like something had cracked on the way down. And then I remember his voice from somewhere above me, changing, going from cold to calculating. He crouched down and I saw his face, and it was not the face of a man who had lost control. It was the face of a man who was already solving a problem. "Get up," he said. "Dorothy, get up right now." I couldn't. My wrist wouldn't hold my weight, and my ribs screamed every time I tried to breathe deeply. That's when he called 911, and I lay there on that kitchen floor, listening to his voice go smooth and worried and completely unrecognizable. "She fell," he told them. "I came in from the garage and she'd just gone down. I think she hit her head on the counter. I don't know how long she was on the floor." "Please hurry." His voice cracked on the last part. I had watched him perform for 30 years of church committees and PTA meetings, and that crack was the best acting I'd ever heard from him. I closed my eyes. I tried to think. This was the moment. I knew it the way you know certain things in your body before your mind catches up. If I let him walk me out of this the way he'd walked out of everything else, it would be the last time. Something in the way he'd looked at me when he crouched down told me that. The paramedics were young, a man and a woman, both probably in their late 20s. They were professional and careful, and he stood right there the whole time, hand on my shoulder, speaking for me when he could. "She's had a long day. She's been a bit unsteady lately. I've been meaning to get her into the doctor." I was in the garage and heard the crash. He had a whole story. It was already fully formed, detailed, concerned. The young woman, her name tag said Patricia, worked on my wrist while her partner checked my head and ribs. She asked me questions directly, kept making eye contact. But he was right there, and every time I opened my mouth, I saw his hand on my shoulder tightened just slightly. "I don't know what happened," I said. My voice came out thin and old, and I hated myself for it. They took me to the hospital. He rode in the car behind the ambulance. Of course he did. In the ER, they put me in a bay and pulled the curtain, and for a few minutes, just a few, I was without him. A doctor came in, not young, not old, 50s maybe. Reading glasses on a cord around her neck, which struck me as strange and sad and somehow clarifying, because he wore his glasses the same way, and I had thought it was endearing when I first met him. Her name was Dr. Aldridge. She examined my wrist. She looked at the X-ray that came back showing a fracture. She looked at my ribs, and then she pulled up the stool beside the bed and sat down at my level, which is the thing I remember most about her, that she sat down, that she made herself the same height as me, that she looked at me like I was a full human being and not a problem to be processed. She said very quietly, "I'd like to ask you a few questions, and I'd like to ask them before your husband comes back in. Is that all right with you?" I looked at the curtain. I could hear him on the other side of it, talking to a nurse. I could hear him being charming. "Yes," I said. She said, "The injury pattern on your wrist is consistent with a fall, but the bruising on your back and the way your ribs are presenting isn't. I've been doing this for 22 years. She paused. She didn't look away from me. "I need you to tell me the truth about what happened tonight. And this is the part that's hardest to explain to someone who hasn't been there." It wasn't relief I felt. Not yet. It was terror, clean and cold, because I had been through 22 months of being told no one would believe me. And here was someone asking me to test that theory in real time, with my husband 8 feet away on the other side of a curtain. I said, "If I tell you?" "He's going to know," she said. "We have security in this building. You are a patient, and he does not have the right to be in this room right now. If you tell me the truth, I will make sure he does not get near you tonight." She said it the way she probably said everything. Quiet, certain, with no performance in it at all. I don't know why I believed her. Maybe because she didn't try too hard. Maybe because she wasn't asking me to be brave or be strong, or think about other women who needed my voice. She was just asking me to tell the truth to one person in one room. So I did. Once I started, I couldn't stop. 22 months of it came out in a hospital bay in Columbus, Ohio, and Dr. Aldridge sat there on that stool and didn't rush me and didn't look away. And when I got to the part about the kitchen floor and the way his face had looked when he crouched over me, she pressed her lips together and nodded once, like she was filing it carefully. When I finished, she stepped outside for a moment. When she came back, she told me that she had already called for a patient advocate and that security had been asked to keep my husband in the family waiting room. She told me that the police had been contacted because her report was mandatory under Ohio state law for injuries consistent with domestic violence, and she needed to document everything she saw before I left that room. He is going to say I'm confused, I told her. He is going to say I'm an old woman who fell and got disoriented. He's going to say it so calmly that people will believe him. She looked at me steadily. She said, "He might try that. But your x-rays don't lie. Your bruising doesn't lie. And I've been a mandated reporter for 2 decades. His word is one data point. Everything else in this room is evidence." The patient advocate who came was a woman named Rosie, small and quick-moving, with a lanyard full of laminated cards and the kind of efficiency that felt like being caught by a net. She sat with me and explained what would happen. A police officer would take my statement. The hospital would photograph my injuries with my consent. I would not be discharged to go home with him tonight. She said there were options for where I could go. She said my safety was the priority. I kept waiting for the part where someone would hesitate, where someone would say, "Well, of course we want to help, but..." There was no but. The police officer was a woman around my daughter's age. She was patient and precise. She wrote down everything I said and read it back to me and asked if she'd gotten it right. When I said yes, she nodded and told me that based on my statement and the medical documentation, they had enough to bring him in for questioning tonight. She asked me if I had family I could contact. I hadn't spoken to my daughter as honestly as I should have in 2 years. I had been protecting her from the truth because I was ashamed of it, and because I was afraid of the look on her face when she found out how long I'd known and said nothing. But Rosie made the call for me. She stood in the corner of that room and spoke to my daughter in a low, careful voice, and I watched the ceiling and thought about the yellow roses I'd carried at my wedding, and I didn't cry. My daughter was there in 40 minutes. She came through that curtain and stopped when she saw me and made a sound I never want to hear her make again. She crossed the room and took my good hand in both of hers and didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, "Mom, just Mom." "I know," I said. "I'm sorry it took me so long." She shook her head. She said, "You don't apologize to me for 1 second. Do you hear me? My son drove in from Dayton that same night." By the time they brought him into the family waiting room in handcuffs for questioning, both of my children were with me. I did not see his face. I'm glad. I think seeing his face in that moment might have undone something in me that I needed to stay intact. He was not arrested that night, but he was taken in for questioning and not permitted to return to the house while the investigation was open. My daughter took me home, her home, and I slept in her guest room with the door open and the hall light on, like I was a child, and it was the best sleep I'd had in almost 2 years. What followed was long. I won't pretend otherwise. There were weeks of statements and photographs and conversations with a district attorney's office that was cautious but thorough. There was a moment where I genuinely believed he might walk away from it because he was, in every outward respect, exactly the kind of man juries like: educated, articulate, community-minded, grief-stricken at the idea that his beloved wife had misunderstood his behavior. But Dr. Aldridge's documentation was meticulous. The photographs were thorough. And when investigators spoke to a woman in Michigan, his first wife's sister, she told them things about his first marriage that she had never told anyone. Things she had been carrying for 15 years, waiting for someone to finally ask the right questions. He accepted a plea agreement. He avoided trial in exchange for a guilty plea on 2 counts of domestic assault. He was sentenced to 4 years, required to complete a batterer intervention program, and permanently prohibited from holding any position working with minors. The teaching certificate he'd had for 40 years was revoked. 4 years is not enough. I know that. I live with that. But I also live with the knowledge that his name is on a record now. That the next woman who meets a silver-haired retired educator at her church and types his name into a search can find what he is. That matters. I have told myself it matters. I spent 3 months at my daughter's house, before I moved into my own apartment. It's in a building with a doorman and a security system and neighbors who know my name. I chose everything in it myself, every dish, every curtain, every book on the shelf. There are a lot of books on the shelf. I went back to therapy. I had done grief counseling after my first husband died, and I thought I understood what healing looked like. But this was different. This was not grief for a person. This was grief for my own judgment, for the years I'd spent doubting myself, for the version of me that walked into that church and thought she was too wise and too old to be fooled. My therapist has a word for what he did to me: coercive control. It has a name. It is a recognized pattern. It was not in my imagination. Knowing that has mattered more than I expected it to. My children call every day now, not every Sunday, every day. I know it's partly worry, and I'm trying to help them move toward trust, but I won't lie. I like the sound of their voices. I wasted 2 years keeping them at a careful distance to protect his secrets, and I don't intend to waste another day of being at arm's length from people who love me. I am 64 years old, and I am starting over, and I would be lying if I said it didn't frighten me sometimes. The financial piece alone has been a mountain. I had walked away from 2 years of retirement income. I'd allowed accounts to be restructured in ways that will take time to untangle, and I am doing this with a legal aid attorney because I cannot afford a private one. It is hard. I am not going to prettify that. But hard is not the same as impossible, and impossible is what I thought I was facing on that kitchen floor. I want to say something now specifically to the women watching this who are older, who are in their 50s or 60s or beyond, who maybe got into something later in life and feel like you should have known better, feel like nobody will believe you because you are supposed to be past the age of making this kind of mistake. Feel like leaving at this point is too complicated or too humiliating or too much. I was you. I had every one of those thoughts. I talked myself out of reaching out so many times because I could not stand the idea of being an old woman who'd been fooled by a man with peach preserves and a volunteer record. I want to tell you that shame kept me in that house longer than fear did. And I want to tell you that the shame was a lie he'd built and installed in me very carefully. And when I finally let someone else into the room, the whole structure of it fell apart. You are not too old. You are not too far in. You are not too embarrassing or too complicated or too much of a mess to deserve help. If you are in danger right now, please call the National Domestic Violence Hotline. The number is 1-800-799-7233. You can also text START to 88788. Both are free, both are confidential, both are available around the clock, and they will talk to you wherever you are in your situation, whether you're ready to leave or just trying to figure out what's real. If you are watching this and you have a mother or an aunt or a neighbor or a woman at your church who seems different than she used to be, quieter, more apologetic, canceling plans, with a husband who always seems to be nearby when you talk to her, please ask her a direct question. Not, "Are you okay?" Because we are all trained to say yes. Ask her, "Are you safe?" Give her the space to tell the truth. Be someone she can tell the truth to. Dr. Aldridge was that person for me. She was thorough and careful, and she sat down at my level and asked me the right question, and then she listened to the answer, and she acted on it. I don't know if she understands what that night meant to me. I wrote her a letter a few months after the sentencing because I needed her to know that the 20 minutes she spent being deliberate and unhurried in that hospital bay changed the entire remainder of my life. I don't know if she got it. I hope she did. This is my life now. It is smaller than the one I imagined when I married him, and larger than the one I had while I was with him. I walk to the library 3 mornings a week, not as an employee, but as a patron now, and I sit in the reading room by the window and I read things that nobody has an opinion about but me. My daughter is getting married next spring, and I am helping her plan it. My son's youngest just started talking in full sentences, and he sends me voice messages of her, and I listen to them more than I probably should. It is a good life. It is mine. And I am still here. If this story reached you, if some part of what I said sounded familiar, or gave you language for something you've been trying to name, or made you feel a little less alone in something you've been carrying, please share it. Leave a comment below. Tell me where you're watching from. Tell me what you're carrying. I read every one. And subscribe to this channel because there are more stories here. Stories from women who got out and are building something real on the other side. You are worth saving. It is not too late. I promise you, it is not too late.